Hello, Zero Books readers. In this video, we'll trace a critique of digital modernity through 3 Zero Books titles. We'll consider how the sometimes conservative and sometimes radical critic Christopher Lasch offered a similar critique back in the 20th century, and we'll take a look at the 2010 motion picture Inception. And we'll do all this while attempting to understand the recent rising up of what some centrist Democrats are calling the alt-left. Let's start with the tag alt-left. Most consider the designation to be nothing more than a smear, a slur cooked up by centrist Democrats in order to associate the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party with the alt-right. And to a large extent, this is true. Yet, if you take a look at some of the critics who have been described by this pejorative, you'll find that there is at least one trait an otherwise motley crew have in common. So let's take a look at the list of names James Walcott gave us in his essay, The Alt-Left is a Problem Too. Here they are: Michael Tracy, Connor Kilpatrick, Jeremy Scahill, Mark Ames, Freddie DeBoer, Tulsi Gabbard, Cornel West, and Jill Stein. What do these characters have in common? Walcott says that they were all disillusioned by Obama's presidency, that they all loathe Hillary Clinton, and that they are all socialists. However, what we should consider is the possibility that, far from sharing a clear conception of socialism, what these people share is really an ability to see the mainstream of leftish ideology and politics as something worthy of critique. Not only are they all disillusioned with the Democratic Party, but further they are disenchanted with what passes for progressive values in what we'll go ahead and call bourgeois society or bourgeois democracies. This willingness to criticize and even attempt to overcome what most take to be the left, but which might be better thought of as the tolerant side of capitalism, is what defines the group's identity. It's easy to see that the tradition of the so-called alt-left is hardly new. For example, nearly 40 years ago, a self-identified socialist and professor at the University of Rochester became disenchanted with then-contemporary ideas about progress and individual freedom. After witnessing the rise of the New Left in the 60s and its disintegration in the 70s, Christopher Lasch decided that American radicals had become cut off from everyday American life. He felt that the left had lost sight of its main goal and its main reason for existence, namely the struggle for economic justice, and in the absence of a legitimate left, this left became part of a culture of narcissism.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves.
In the opening chapter of his 1979 book, Christopher Lasch described the problem this way. Americans seem to wish to forget not only the 60s, the riots, the New Left, the disruptions on college campuses, Vietnam, Watergate, and the Nixon presidency, but their entire collective past. To live for the moment is a prevailing passion. To live for yourself, not for your predecessors or for posterity. We are fast losing the sense of historical continuity. Lasch's critique of America at the end of the Me decade seems true of the West in general today, and it is repeated by today's public intellectuals. For instance, in Mark Fisher's 2009 book, Capitalist Realism, Fisher quotes the leftist filmmaker Adam Curtis, who, echoing Lasch, said during an interview with The Register that, quote, "What people suffer from is being trapped within themselves. In a world of individualism, Everyone is trapped within their own feelings, trapped within their own imaginations. Curtis described his job, as a public service broadcaster, to be the task of taking people beyond the limits of their own self. And in Grafton Tanner's book on Vaporwave from 2016, Tanner quotes the cultural critic Simon Reynolds, who pinned the blame for this culture of narcissism and the attendant loss of historicity on the iPod. Because we have access to everything all the time, it is a struggle to recall that life wasn't always like this, that relatively recently one lived most of the time in a cultural present tense, with the past confined to specific zones. Apparently, the advent of the iPod had laid out all of human history as if on a menu for today's postmodern consumer. Each individual could pick and choose from the entirety of at least 20th century culture and get the past delivered instantaneously to his device as yet another pleasure to be consumed by what seemed to be an eternal or immortal self. And in a recent interview to promote her book, Kill All Normies, a critique of the online culture wars, Zero Book's author Angela Nagel stated her debt to Christopher Lasch directly.
More broadly, politically, I'd say the biggest influence would be somebody like Christopher Lasch. I think I would be probably closest to him politically.
Given this debt to Christopher Lasch, it's worthwhile to examine the nature of his critique more deeply. Just what does he mean, for instance, when he speaks of narcissism? Well, for starters, he is not referring to something as simple as selfishness or self-regard. Narcissism, as a term of art from psychoanalysis, is two-sided. The narcissist is self-centered, not merely out of self-admiration or conceit, but due to a failure to distinguish the self from external objects. At the extreme end of narcissism, one doesn't really put oneself above others, but loses track of the outside world altogether. The narcissist is like a baby who's yet to learn that the world remains even when he isn't looking at it. The narcissist, then, is engaged in a life played out as a game of peekaboo. According to Lasch, when narcissism is expressed in literature, you get works like Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle, a book that announces on the very first page that nothing in this book is true. When narcissism is expressed in philosophical terms, you get a radical skepticism, a process of thinking like the one in Descartes' Meditations, wherein the whole of external existence is doubted, and all that is left is the self as a thinker. But this self is entirely denuded of particularity or consequence. The self becomes an empty vessel, a vessel that is filled up with impressions of a fluctuating and disordered world. What's left after the world has been undermined is a self. Lasch's narcissist that is unable to differentiate its own essence from that which is beyond it. What you get is a self that has merged with the world. In his 2014 book, Ghosts of My Life, Fisher dedicates 16 pages to Nolan's 2010 blockbuster, Inception, and he particularly focuses on the question of the film's ending. Fisher interrogates the infamously unsatisfying ambiguity of the spinning top, the unanswered question of whether the protagonist Cobb has found his way back to the reality of his domestic life, or whether he is caught in a dream. Fisher writes, quote, "The question of whether Cobb is still dreaming or not at the end of the film is ultimately too simple. Impersonal misery may be what Inception is ultimately about, the non-specific but pervasive pathos that hangs over the film, a sadness that arises from the impasse of a culture in which business has closed down any possibility of an outside." You yearn for foreign places, but everywhere you go looks like local color or the film set of a commercial. You want to be lost in Escher-esque mazes, but you end up in an interminable car chase. What's perhaps most interesting is that while Adam Curtis, Grafton Tanner, and Mark Fisher decry the stagnation that our lasting narcissism represents, Christopher Lasch blamed the quest for progress for the disorder. Fisher longs for a feeling of unfamiliarity or for Escher-esque mazes, but Christopher Lasch writes in his book, The True and Only Heaven, that in today's consumer society, nothing is certain except the imminent obsolescence of all our certainties. Our scientific certainties, our technology, our artistic styles and schools, our philosophies, our political ideals, our fashions, naturally give rise to the sense of impermanence that has been celebrated or deplored as the very essence of the modern outlook, the sense that all that is solid melts into air. So how can it be that our modern world is both stagnant and always changing? How can it be that we seem to have reached the end of history even as nothing stands still? The answer is that capitalism is itself built upon a contradiction. It is a system that demands constant innovation and acceleration, even as it preserves a core relationship between worker and capital. Our society is, and has to be, both relentlessly progressive and fundamentally conservative. And a failure to understand this aspect of modern life, a return to a merely redistributionist politics, aimed at creating economic justice within a system that requires exploitation and inequality, will at best lead to a repetition of Lasch and Fisher. We will continue to reproduce critical works that are aimed at critiquing either our stagnation or at the alienation we feel in the midst of constant, chaotic change.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.